What is going on, everybody? Today we are making a big 6x8 workbench, so if that's something that you can use in your shop, stick around. First, pick the dimension of workbench that seems appropriate for the space that you have. You don't want it to be too big and a burden to the space. You still want enough open room. I ended up going with 6x8, so those are the frames that I'm cutting out here now. Then you've got to pick how tall you want this bad boy to be. I ended up picking 36 inches because that was a comfortable height for me. So I cut these posts at 30 inches because I had 6-inch caster wheels that I was attaching. So I'm using 3.5-inch deck screws here. I just wanted to get enough bite into those 4x4s because that's kind of the only thing that's connecting this lower shelf to the posts. I cut that last 4x4 post a little bit shorter than the rest just because I knew that's where I was going to have my table saw. If you are unsure of what end you want your table saw to be on, I would just leave it as long as the other ones so you can kind of shuffle it around and cut it, when you actually put your table saw in. I'm a classic overbuilder, so I ended up putting 2 screws on each side of these 4x4s, but you could probably get away with less, but why risk it? A quick meeting with my safety supervisor to make sure we can flip this bench over safely, and then we'll get to it. So the key to not getting crushed by your projects is flipping them as early as possible if you have to. If you can't avoid it, you just gotta muscle it through, I guess. But yes, if you can avoid flipping it later in the project when you've added all that weight, you're much better off. So I'm lining these caster wheels up and I'll drill pilot holes so that 4x4 doesn't split. And then just using standard bolts. These are 1.25-inch bolts going into the bottom of that 4x4. It should be more than sturdy enough. These are 350-pound caster wheels, so they're more than heavy duty enough to withstand the projects and the tools and the supplies that I'll be putting on this thing. If everything went right, you should have a pretty level foundation. At this point in the adventure, you have a choice to make. Do I spend exponentially more money on plywood, or do I settle for OSB and I'm just okay with that look? I clearly ended up going with plywood. It was worth the little bit of extra money per sheet to have, I thought, a nicer product in the end. But ultimately, OSB would have done the exact same thing and would have worked just fine for this application. Here you can see my safety supervisor clearly doesn't trust me when I use these saws. She's always walking behind me, making sure I'm not doing anything dumb or cutting myself. I tried to make this plywood go over those posts as snug as I could. In the end, I was pretty happy with how it turned out, but here you'll see it was kind of a struggle getting these on here, especially a one-man wood shop like what I got going on here. It was a little bit tricky, but in the end, I liked how snugly they fit, and I thought it made it look a little more professional. And then you'll just repeat the process on the other side, which was a whole lot easier because of that short 4x4. Now that you've got your sheets on, you can just go across and start securing that to the bottom section of 2x4s. Here I'm just using 2-inch drywall screws. They're just cheap and they get the job done, which makes me feel better about putting a screw every 4 to 6 inches. Now comes the fun part when we get to start framing out the upper portion of our table. And you really have to think about your space and how you use it as to where you want your chop saw and where your table saw goes. My plan was to push the bench against the wall where that current bench is, so I wanted my miter saw to be on the left side. So having decided that, I was going to start framing out where my table saw would go. I used these pocket hole jigs from Craig. They're super handy, and especially they kind of hide the screws, and I didn't want to have to lift this thing up and screw up from the bottom. So make this nice little pocket. And just use those deck screws to secure this to the plywood. This is where you start to get a lot of creative freedom to make it what you want. So choose your table saw spot, your miter saw spot, the best arrangement that works for your work area. But other than that, you can kind of do whatever you want with it. I'm going to put a dust collection system in eventually, as well as a shelf system. But for now, I'm just kind of going for the open storage on the bottom. Here we've got our miter saw section framed out. You'll just take a rough measurement off your saw and to give you the area that you need to build. I would recommend taking into account all the pivoting and the swinging that the saw does when you're measuring. If you guys have made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you for watching, and I hope it's been helpful. I know whenever I'm trying to build something, it's always good to have a reference. So if this is something that you're interested in building or think you might need, hopefully this gives you an idea of where to start at least. So, or at least can be a template for you. That's the beauty of this, is it's kind of can be tweaked to whatever you want. For me personally, I've been wanting to start doing epoxy tables. So that little 2x8 workbench against the wall was just not going to cut it for having big molds out and mixing epoxy and live edge slabs and things like that. So I decided to build this workbench, and I didn't want the ability to push it against the wall and have a little open space, because this is still a garage and shop, but have the miter saw be available to still cut things if I needed, and then have that work area on the back side to where I could have a mold going or mix things or do whatever is needed. So now we're at the point where we're throwing these top sheets on, and man, did they go on easier. So you're going to take your jigsaw and you'll just make an outline by sticking your tape under there and seeing where you hit a 2x4, and you'll be able to draw that outline on the top. Same as before, you'll use these 2-inch deck screws, and you can put them pretty liberally across the top. I ended up with one about every 6 inches. Again, that's probably overbuilt a little bit, but it's up to you. I hope I have some folks that like math out there, because this was probably the most math heavy part of this build. And what I did was I took the height of the miter saw, and to figure out what height I needed to make my table, I reverse engineered it down essentially from the top of my workbench. I subtracted the 4 inches that was what my miter saw was, and then I factored in the 2 inches for the 2x4s, and then I was able to figure out how tall I needed to cut those uprights. After all that number crunching, I still forgot to add in the 1/2 inch for the plywood that I was putting on top, so I ended up having to recut these. Just cutting out that table saw portion now. I had to go through the same mathematical process that I did with my miter saw for my table saw to figure out how much I needed to cut off this post. A couple things I would do differently about this build. Number one would be make sure that you have a wide enough area for your table saw fence arms to go to 0. I ran into an issue where that table saw section wasn't wide enough, and my table saw couldn't go to 0. So I had to extend it out to the right a little bit, and every time I use it now I have to just scoot it over, so any cuts under 4 inches can actually be made. So make sure that's wide enough before you put any posts in on the top portion of your bench. Secondly, I would recommend putting another caster wheel on that long section of the table, that 8-foot section, and that's something that I went back and did. But if you can do that earlier on in the build, you'll save yourself a lot of time and heartache. Again, I want to thank you guys for watching, and hopefully this was a helpful demonstration of one way to build a workbench. You can see it cleared up a lot of space, and I have a much larger work area and more open floor space because I'm not constantly throwing sawhorses in the middle of my garage. So thank you guys for watching. I hope it was helpful, and we will talk to you later.